Hey gang, welcome back to another video. So this week my love of inconsequential props has taken me down the rabbit hole once again. But this time it's to the Detention block camera from Star Wars: A New Hope, a prop that gets less than 10 seconds of total screen time, but has clearly left an impression on fans and prop makers like me. So let's get into it. My process with all replicas starts by learning as much as I can about the prop. And after some searches online and reading some amazing build logs on the Replica prop forum, I found this was made with 6 Patterson Trident slide viewers, along with a few button lights. With that information in hand, I started searching online for the build, only to find that these slide viewers cost roughly $60 to $100 a piece on auction sites. Now, using that as a baseline, if I were to buy them, I'd be spending over $600 for just the slide viewer, and that won't work. So with that info in hand, I found that Whitey's Wicked Workshop on Etsy had tackled 3D modeling the slide viewer and button lights. His files looked true to the actual part, so there was no point in me modeling them myself, but I made a few modifications in Fusion for my own build, including adding mounting holes into the back and accentuating some of the smaller details so they'd be a bit more visible once printed. Once I had the files looking how I wanted, I printed them out and could get to every maker's least favorite task: trimming supports and sanding. Resin printers do a great job, but they're not always blemish-free. So I sat down at the bench with my model nippers and some 120 grit sandpaper that I attached to tongue depressors with a bit of spray adhesive and got to smoothing everything out. Because there's multiple pieces to each slide viewer, I decided to work in shifts, trimming any remnant supports, squaring off the edges, and removing any layer lines I could see in the prints. Since these pieces are the star of the prop, I wanted to take a bit more time to really minimize any layer lines that could potentially catch the light, and for that I decided to do some wet sanding. This not only keeps my sandpaper from clogging up with resin dust, but also keeps that same resin dust out of the air and by proxy out of my lungs. So with my trusty mini spray bottle of water at the ready, I got to wetting down my 3D print as well as the sandpaper and gave the parts a good sanding. I'll repeat this step with the front bezel, switching between pieces of sandpaper and my homemade sanding sticks until I think I've got everything addressed, and then I can repeat it 5 more times, since this box of parts isn't going to prep itself. When all of that was done, I grabbed my new favorite automotive filler primer and applied a dust coat to each piece, followed by a heavier coat after allowing the solvents to flash off from the previous coat. The dust coat creates a bit of tension on the surface, which allows the heavier coat something to grab onto, which in turn prevents, or at least minimizes, any drips in your paint. This approach is definitely something I recommend if you find that you're prone to over-application. Thankfully, no one will see the insides of these parts, so once they were dry, I could prep them for paint, starting with a bit of dust removal with my rechargeable air duster, followed by a tack cloth to make sure that the surfaces are as particle-free as possible. For this top coat, I'm using the same approach as the primer, starting with a light dust coat, followed by a short pause to allow the solvents in the paint to flash off before applying a heavier beauty coat. This method really minimizes the likelihood of runs in your paint, but it's not a license to go crazy, so you'll still want to really pay attention to how the paint is laying down to avoid potential blemishes in your paint job. I swapped out the parts and switched to the next set, repeating the same process over again before setting them all aside to dry. While I waited, I switched colors and got to painting the lens holder, which have a two-tone paint job. So I laid down the first lighter color to the entire piece, allowed them to dry completely, and then it was time to do some masking. While it seems like it would have been easier to mask off the protruding frame, it would have taken a bit more paint to get solid coverage of light blue over the darker blue, which is just inviting the paint to run or orange peel. So for that reason, I decided to mask the flat surface and then apply the dark blue over the light. But before I do that, I want to ensure that my masking lines are as sharp as possible. So I'm applying the light blue first, which should fill in any small gaps in my masking, and once it's partially dry, I'll apply the darker blue. This technique can be used for any painting project, including painting with a brush, and is a go-to for me for when I need crisp lines. After a few minutes of dry time, when I could see that the paint had lost the shininess of a fresh paint job, I got to carefully removing my masking, pulling the tape at 45 degrees to the surface to make sure it doesn't accidentally remove any of the paint that I want to keep. Now I can see that it's a little patchy on top, but thankfully it'll be hidden by the bezel. Plus I've got 5 more of these to do so I can improve on my technique. At this point, I shifted gears and decided to do a bit of work on the small button light details. These are even harder to find than the slide viewers are, so I printed them up and will paint them a matte black, followed by a gloss varnish in preparation for a chrome paint finish. The matte black will help to deepen the metallic finish, which in turn will help these parts look more like actual metal. Lighter colors like gray will create a look more like aluminum, without having to use a different paint. With the matte black dry, I can switch over to the gloss varnish. This layer enhances the metallic effect by providing a smooth reflective surface for the metal flakes in the paint to sit on, allowing for better reflectivity. Skipping this step will result in a really dull finish, and that's not what I'm aiming for with these parts. You'll also want to make sure not to over-apply the gloss here, since it can slump and create unwanted ripples in your finish. When the varnish was dry, I loaded up my airbrush with my favorite metallic paint and got to chroming. I'm applying this paint at around 15 psi and building up to the final finish by applying multiple light layers until I have complete coverage. Now I was in a bit of a rush while doing this, so it's not as clean as I'd have liked, but the clouds had really started to push in and I know my time was running out. And then...
Now with the local fire still burning, I can't complain about the rain, but it definitely stopped me dead in my tracks. So I think this is where I'll wrap it up for this week, and once the rain passes, I'll get to finishing up this project. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Be sure to like and subscribe if you haven't already, but most importantly, go make something.